Hello and welcome to this Joe Politics special. I'm Ollie Dugmore and today we're going to be discussing the prospect of a second Brexit referendum. It's just months until the UK leaves the EU now and there's very little clarity about the state of play and there's no consensus in the government either. Debate grows ever more intense, no more so than on Twitter, between journalist Peter Hitchens and Labour peer Andrew Adonis, who join me now. Peter, you have described a so-called people's vote as dangerously arrogant and said that you hate all referenda. Could you lay out your position for us, please?
Well, I do. First of all, referenda are often manipulated by the powerful, and they're a way of getting people to endorse what the powerful want, or alternatively, they're escapes by the powerful from their own responsibilities, and that's very much the case with the European Union referendum, in which I took no part and didn't vote. And I am astonished that after the obvious constitutional car crash which has been caused by this referendum, that anyone should now want another one. And also I'm quite annoyed by the way in which Andrew calls it the people's vote. Who do you think voted in the previous one? Squirrels? We've had a people's vote. It's got us into quite enough trouble as it is. And I'd like to put to you as an opening question to you, really. When you were in government as a minister, you were in, of course, the House of Lords yourself. But where do you think the legitimacy of that government came from?
The legitimacy comes from the people.
And it came from them in the form of a democratic vote. So presumably yes. You're prepared to operate with that as the legitimising force in British politics, that the government has been elected through a system of majority voting where the majority decides.
Well, it's not the government that's elected, of course, it's Parliament that's elected.
Yes.
And that's a crucial distinction. It's a constitutionalist,
it's not a crucial distinction in this argument.
Oh, it is, because Parliament may well decide something different from the government in this case. This is the reason why we're in this mess. We have a government which doesn't have a majority in Parliament.
But I'm talking about legitimacy. I'm saying where does you exercise power as a minister, and the legitimacy of that power, the source of your authority, was the fact that you were serving a government which had been elected to govern on a manifesto in a general election. And so basically you accepted personally in your own life the idea that legitimacy comes from accepting the verdict of the majority in either a parliamentary constituency or wherever it happens to be. Likewise, in Parliament, you accept the corollary, which is where the act is passed by a majority, it becomes law. Where it isn't, it doesn't. Yet on this occasion, where there has been a majority, you propose to unravel that and say, well, that majority, I don't like it, so
Peter,
let's do it again.
Andrew a chance to reply.
That's completely wrong. My legitimacy when I was a minister came from the fact that I served a government that not only had a parliamentary majority, but could get its legislation through Parliament. The moment that a government cannot get Parliament to agree with what it wants to do, whether it be a budget or a piece of legislation or conference, at that moment its authority vanishes. And it then has to do, because we're a parliamentary democracy, it has to do what Parliament wants. The reason why, when I was a minister, we didn't have those problems is because we had a reliable parliamentary majority that would vote things through. The situation that we're now in, which is the reason why we have this crisis, and as it happens, I'm not, in principle, more in favour of referendums than you, but we did have one 2 years ago, and therefore the only way of resolving this crisis, in my view, is another one. But the reason why
you are more in favour of it because you're calling for one and I'm not, so you are.
Oh, I'm in favour of one,
exactly,
yes. But I actually agree with you, in principle, that they're a bad idea. The reason why we're in this position...
Well, if you really agree with me in principle, you wouldn't be calling for one.
No, because I'm afraid, being a pragmatist, whereas, of course, you're an absolutist, I'm dealing with the situation we actually face. And the situation we actually face is a crisis brought on by the fact that we had a referendum. I myself was not in favour of that referendum, but it happened. It's a fact. We're in this situation now. It is also a fact that we have a government whose legitimacy is very weak because it cannot rely on a parliamentary majority. And if we have this people's vote, a referendum, the reason why we will have it, and it's vital to understand this, is not because people like me are calling for it and have some rights, some constitutional right to require there to be a referendum. It will be because there is a majority in the House of Commons, which is the sovereign body of the United Kingdom, for that referendum. And I say to you, if I can put a question to you, is if the majority of the House of Commons vote for a referendum and want to put Theresa May's treaty or the consequences of no deal to the people, what is undemocratic about that?
Well, it'd be a grave mistake because it does...
It may be a mistake, but that doesn't mean it's wrong.
Ask me a question, I could explain why I'm giving the answer that I'm giving. It would be a grave mistake because it would repeat the error that we made of creating two sources of legitimacy in our constitution instead of one. So we have two. Two completely different votes, one a general election and one a referendum, from which authority derives its power and its instructions, and they conflict, which is the reason for our current constitutional crisis. You have, in fact, totally missed my point. I wasn't arguing about the European issue. I was arguing about legitimacy, and the point that I was making was that if you accept that democratic majorities legitimize, then you have to think very carefully about unraveling democratic majorities and saying that one didn't count. Even Richard Nixon, a man for whom I don't think either of us have much respect, in 1960 realized it would be a grave mistake, though he could have done, to challenge the election of John F. Kennedy because there'd been significant, how should we put it, suspicious activities in various parts of the country which could conceivably have delivered JFK a majority. He decided not to raise it because he knew that it would gravely damage the democratic legitimacy of any future US government. And we saw what happened with Al Gore and George W. Bush and the challenge over the hanging chairs in Florida, how much damage that did permanently to American democracy. Yeah. You're in the same game.
No,
you're saying I don't like the outcome of this vote, therefore let's hold it against. We're talking about whether it is either wise or justified, or indeed principled, or indeed consistent for Andrew, a minister in a government,
it's wise, justified,
minister in a government which derives its
people
authority from democratic endorsement, is whether it's wise or principled for you to be calling for a reopening of a closed vote. And in my view, not merely is it unwise and unprincipled, as I've explained, but also it continues to do the same damage to British politics that the first referendum did. It allows the political class, in which I include you, to run away from your responsibilities. As long as you keep handing back this question to the general public in the form of a referendum, you are freed from having to do the thing which the whole political class obviously has to do, which is to make an intelligent compromise between the two sides.
Well, I believe
which also will involve risking your own, not in your case because you're in the Lords, but everybody in the Commons risking their futures in the verdict of a general election when that comes.
I believe it's both wise and justified and principled and consistent to be in favour of a people's vote, a referendum at this stage, because of the position that we're in. And you have to deal with the real-life position that we're in. It is perfectly possible that Parliament could deal with this issue itself. I'm not justifying its right to do that. The sovereign power of the United Kingdom is Parliament. If Parliament chose simply to reject Theresa May's treaty, which would be my recommendation to it, given the likely shape of that treaty, it's perfectly possible and constitutionally legitimate for it to do so. The issue which we have to face, though, is precisely because we did have a referendum 2 years ago, and the people did, extremely narrowly, reach a judgment that they wanted this process to start, which is what's led us to the situation we're in now with the Brexit negotiations. And the belief, which I hold very strongly, that the people having expressed that view, when the terms are apparent, and they will, I hope, be apparent later this year, or the breakdown in the negotiations, when they can actually see the deal, which of course wasn't available 2 years ago when they voted because there had been no negotiations, my view, on balance, I don't say it in an absolutist way, you've given very absolutist views, I don't say it in an absolutist way, Parliament could do this itself, but on balance I think the right democratic course is for the people themselves to give their view as to whether they want the treaty or whether they prefer, as I will recommend to them, that they stay in the EU and don't put their jobs and livelihoods at risk.
The people were asked, as in my view they shouldn't have been, but they were asked whether they wanted to leave the European Union or not. And they were asked on the basis of a referendum which was decided by a simple majority. And the simple majority said that we should leave the European Union. The rest of it was left to the political class. Now, at the moment, we have a position where, whether it's Anna Suu or Jacob Rees-Mogg, they can stick very hard to a dogmatic position of one thing or the other and refuse completely to offer any kind of compromise to each other. They can be allowed to operate entirely according, in my view, to political ambition and jockeying for the future.
I don't think Jacob is
you
anyway.
make that easier for them by
Total
opening the prospect of a second referendum, because that simply absolves them of the responsibility. David Cameron ran away from his responsibility by calling that referendum.
I debate with Jacob.
I
debate with Jacob all the time. Do you seriously think he's in the game of compromise? I've never known Jacob compromise in his life. The reason why he's out of government government on the far right is proposing a no-deal Brexit and has taken these absolutist positions all the way through. Is compromise is not the language that he deals in.
Well,
Some people do politics in different ways.
Nobody,
he doesn't.
Nobody deals
So we're not going to get an
Nobody
agreement
deals with
Jacob.
compromise until they have to.
No, Jacob never has to, because he doesn't have responsibility. He never has to do he doesn't have responsibility.
In my view,
so
if there were no possibility
of
a second referendum, and if people fully understood the implications of leaving the European Union without a negotiated deal, then
I agree with that.
Then anybody who stood above that and said, "Well, I'm not going to play any part in this. I'm going to carry on making it impossible for the government to come to any compromise," would be punished by the electors in future elections.
But we're confusing so many different issues here.
They are all confused by the fact that we have two sources of democratic legitimacy.
No, they're confused by the fact that the situation is very confused. Theresa May could, if she wanted to do a soft compromise Brexit, she could do that now. She could have done that at any stage. It's not the threat of a referendum that's stopping her. On the contrary, she herself is strongly against a people's vote. What's stopping her doing it is that she is so weak, she is so unable to negotiate a way forward within her own party, which isn't just with Jacob, it's with David Davis, it's even with people in her own cabinet at the moment. It's Dominic Raab, who's actually doing her negotiations in Brussels, who appears to be strongly against the latest form of the Irish backstop. It's because of that she can't do the deal. What I'm trying to do, and have been seeking to do all the way through, is to find a way out of the crisis that we're in at the moment. And in my view, the best way out by far is to put her agreement, whatever it is that she gets later this year, to the people with a straight option to be able to reject it and stay in the European Union. And then all of the difficulties that you've just set out, Peter, they all fall by the wayside. So we stay in the European Union, and this all becomes a nightmare, and we regard it as
Peter,
on
that point, because you assume the result will be the one that you want.
Could you propose an alternative? Could you propose, if there's a parliamentary deadlock, how does the UK government manoeuvre its way out of that without returning to the people?
To me, it's been obvious for some long time that the compromise is the Norway option, and I think it would be a very satisfactory compromise. It would take into account the fears and worries of both sides. It would take us significantly further from the power of the European Union. It would take us technically out of it, but it would leave us in some ways still connected to us, and so that we would not be economically and otherwise damaged by the sudden unnegotiated exit which now threatens. So that it seems to me that if the political class both understood the issue, which most of them don't, and realised the dangers, which most of them don't yet, then that there's something they could do. But if you give them any excuse to steer away from that responsibility, they will do, because what the fundamental problem here is this was an issue, the issue of Britain's membership of the European Union, which neither of the major political parties would address for 20 years as discontent grew about it. And what they're really afraid of, and both Labour and Conservative parties are afraid of, is a general election in which they'll be judged for their performance over the past couple of years on this matter, and that's what they want to avoid. They will do almost anything to avoid a general election. And you are helping them avoid it by your proposal.
Just quickly though, how would that Norway option play out on the Irish border?
There would be if you went for a straightforward Norway, then there would be the same sort of border that there is between Norway and Sweden. That is to say, there is because Norway isn't in the customs union. I mean, there is a possibility, and in my view, it wouldn't trouble me in the slightest, of adding the customs union to the Norway option, which would leave the Irish border totally unchanged. But it certainly wouldn't create a mass of barbed wire and machine gun nests in the way that people suggest.
The flow of words from Peter the cascade is so long that you sort of lose track of the fact that he said something completely different a while back. He said that it was the referendum that was stopping us getting to the compromise solution. That's what he said.
I'd say it's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons stopping.
If not the thing that's stopping us getting to Norway, let's be completely clear about this. The thing that is stopping us getting to Norway is the Prime Minister and the government that have refused to seek to negotiate Norway.
Well, you don't want to get me to defend them on that.
No, but I'm
giving
you
my... I don't speak for them.
No,
I think it's the reason
why.
Ludicrous government.
It has nothing whatever to do with the threat of a referendum. It has everything to do with the fact that Theresa May will not seek to negotiate Norway. Why? Because she knows her party would split if she negotiated Norway. She set out in her Lancaster House speech, which was her first big statement of policy, she said that the central principle of Brexit is that we must leave the single market and the customs union, and she specifically ruled out Norway. Now, if she was actually doing the job of statecraft, which she's supposed to do as Prime Minister, I agree with you, Peter. What she should be doing is seeking to negotiate something like Norway. I completely agree. She has turned her face against that completely, consistently, and refuses to do so. But that's her fault. It's not to do with the fact that there might be a referendum.
Well, I'm not here to defend her. It's the most ridiculous thing to have a government mainly composed of people who for most of their lives have opposed leaving the European Union, charged with the task of taking us out of it. It was never going to work. Anyone could see that coming. I don't defend it. I think they've made the most tremendous mess of it. But I think my point to you is that by calling for a second referendum, you're making it worse.
Do you know, I actually think we're agreeing. I've just realised that we're actually agreeing.
Well, I knew that from the start. You're the one who's had to fumble your way towards it. I always knew.
No, but we're not agreeing on the point about the referendum, because I still see the referendum as the only way of getting out of this crisis. But we're agreeing on the fact that Theresa May is useless, that she was wrong to rule out Norway and the customs union from the outset, that part of the problem is she's overcompensating. I completely agree. She's overcompensating for the fact that she was a Remainer. And Nick Timothy told her you had to say Brexit means Brexit, which means coming out of everything with the word Europe in the title, that she could and she should have sought to negotiate something close to Norway and the customs union, and that if we had Norway and the customs union, we wouldn't have a problem with the Irish border. I agree with all of those propositions. I agree with every proposition you've given.
What I'm against, and the reason why we're here is because I think you're playing dice with the British Constitution and with democratic legitimacy and possibly with the civil peace of the nation by reopening the issue of the referendum. Yes,
civil peace of the nation.
Once you unravel the acceptance in the population that a democratic verdict is final, then there is no end to the damage that you do. Once that source of legitimacy, you have to let me finish this point. It's the reason I'm here. Once you have unraveled democratic legitimacy as the source of authority, what do you have left?
Why do we have elections, Peter, every 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
So why not have another one now?
Why do we not have, why is it that we have
because the Queen Quennial Act says that's the
no.
says that's the time.
It's because democratic legitimacy needs constant renewal. You do not
constant. No.
It does. It
doesn't
need constant renewal.
It needs periodic renewal. It does not need constant renewal. And in the case of referenda, which, as I say, we shouldn't hold in the first place, but now we have.
Are you saying that a referendum decision holds then for all time?
I would think that it certainly holds for longer than 2 years.
Why? What is the magical period? What's the magical period?
Well, the issue.
What is the period it holds for?
The issue.
By the way, it'll be 3 by next year. But what is the magic period that after which a referendum can be held on the same issue again?
Well, probably a lifetime, actually.
A lifetime.
I would think so.
Why?
Because people have been asked to take a single decision in principle.
So if in
this isn't like a general election where you're offered a basket.
If in 1938 Chamberlain had come back from Munich and had put the Munich Treaty to a referendum and it had passed, as it probably would have done by 3 or 4 to 1, it would have been completely illegitimate then, do you think, to have then sought to take on Germany and reverse appeasement in 39-40?
That is such a complicated problem. I recommend you to read my book, The Phony Victory.
But what's your answer?
It's not. Apart from anything else, a referendum on Munich would have been retrospective.
No, it wouldn't have been. No, it was the whole policy that was going to govern. No, that's not true, because of course Hitler broke the Munich Agreement. This is the whole reason why we moved towards war in 1939, because he breaks the Munich Agreement.
So, Andrew, could you elaborate on your preference here?
It's a ludicrous proposition that a referendum. It's a ludicrous proposition that a referendum has to stick for a whole generation.
We're here discussing.
As soon as you make the proposition, it obviously
how ludicrous referenda are in themselves, certainly as a means of conducting foreign policy. But having held one, you cannot reopen the subject.
That's an assertion.
You cannot.
That's an assertion. It has no democratic legitimacy at all to it. None whatsoever.
You cannot reopen the subject ceaselessly without.
Ceaselessly.
Well, this is
ceaselessly.
Andrew, why can't we just have another snap election?
Actually, if there was an election, the first question that people would need to answer is what are they going to do about Brexit? My party, the Labour Party, if there's a snap election, and I'm not against a snap election, by the way, because I think the government has effectively disintegrated, if there were a snap election now, the first question we would need to answer is what are we going to do about Brexit? And the answer I would offer, we'd have to develop a manifesto, the answer I would offer is that the first clause of our manifesto should be a people's vote vote with an option to stop Brexit. So it doesn't duck the issue. It does give a new source of legitimacy.
Jeremy Corbyn's never going to back that.
I think Jeremy Corbyn would in that circumstance, because he would have to he would himself have to address the same question day in, day out in the election campaign. What would you do on Brexit? And the only clear answer he'd be able to give, in my view, is that he would hold a people's vote to reverse it.
It's hard to begin to describe the ludicrousness of this. People strive for years to become politicians, to get elected as members of parliament, to get ministerial office, to actually have the power to take decisions. And then when they have them, they then turn back to the people from whom they've received this power and say, actually, I can't make up my mind, or I don't dare say what I want. I'm handing it back to you.
Yeah, but I've already answered that. I've already answered that point,
You haven't
Peter.
answered it, actually.
I've answered that point completely.
You blustered around it, but you haven't actually answered it.
I've answered it completely. I would not have held the referendum 2 years ago. I think that was a big mistake. I agree with you that Parliament should have decided this, and it shouldn't have been put to the people. But it was put to the people. There was a referendum. And having held the referendum and got into a situation where the will of the people, we're being told, not least by you in this discussion, means that we have to follow, come hell or high water, that verdict. If we reach the view, as I have reached, and I have responsibilities to set out the position as I see it, that the right thing for the country, having wrestled hard for 2 years with trying to make sense of Brexit, is in fact to stop it, then the best option for doing so is to put this to the people with a clear recommendation that we should reverse Brexit. It's not because I love referendums, it's because of the situation we find ourselves in.
From whom?
In this, from the government. It should come from the government itself. But if it won't come from the government because the government won't do it, it should come from those who are prepared to set out the arguments for staying in the European Union and not doing Brexit, which would be my view.
I don't think you've really considered the possibility of what might happen if it didn't go the way you assume it will. But leaving that aside...
We would leave. Nothing would be different from what's been proposed before. We would leave.
Leaving that aside, I suspect that much of your opposition to the referendum developed after your side lost it, whereas I opposed it before. No, technically my side won it. And
I was never in favour. The Labour Party's policy was against the referendum 2 years ago.
Did you take any part in it?
No, none at all. Because I didn't myself agree with the referendum, and I didn't actually think that the outcome was in doubt, as it happens. But that's neither here nor there. The fact is we weren't in favour of it. We opposed it. This was an internal fix in the Conservative Party because David Cameron thought that the way he would call the bluff of the right wing of his party was by calling a referendum. That's the reason we're in this mess, isn't it?
Both David Cameron and Harold Wilson called referendum on the to save their parties rather than to...
Or to save themselves. Well, save themselves, let's be clear. No, to save themselves.
This is a question
to save themselves. Wilson would have been forced out by Ben and the left in the early 70s when he was leader of the opposition. If he hadn't agreed the referendum, Cameron was in the same position in his party in the run-up to the 2015 election. So this was a big personal calculation which went badly wrong.
Are acts of political cowardice by people who wouldn't take responsibility.
I agree with that completely.
Well, so why would a third referendum at the same time?
Because we're in this mess. We're having to deal with the consequences of David Cameron's cowardice. I mean, we agree with that. It was a terrible mistake. It was done for the worst possible motives. But we are where we are. And the job of people who are in politics who want the best interest of the country is looking at the issues at stake, the democratic principles at stake, what is the best thing. And it's a balance of judgment. I'm not saying, if I thought that this could be resolved in Parliament, there'd be nobody more strongly in favour of it than me. But my judgment is, and it's just a judgment, is that because we did have the referendum 2 years ago, and precisely because of the argument that you've given, that a referendum has a special legitimacy, the way that we revisit this when people can actually see the deal, so they know what's at stake in leaving, which they couldn't know 2 years ago because there wasn't a deal, is for them to have their say.
Just finally then, guys, let's move on to, let's say this referendum takes place. Andrew, what terms would you like to see on the ballot paper?
Well, I think it's very straightforward. It's whatever is Theresa May's deal, because she's negotiating on behalf of the country, to get to do. And I think she will get to do. I don't think we'll be in the no-deal situation because nobody wants pandemonium next March.
I think it's a danger that we will.
Well, whatever she gets as her deal, as against the status quo, staying in the EU. It's a very strict choice. And it is, in fact, the choice, coming back to Peter's concern about Parliament, that is, in fact, the choice that Parliament faces too, because they are the only two practical choices. What the Prime Minister has negotiated, or her negotiating brief, if she doesn't think she can reach an agreement by the end of the year with the EU, as against staying in the EU, which is clearly practical because we're there at the moment.
Peter, you've just said you actually think there's a real risk of a no-deal outcome.
I do.
If that's the case, we're looking at stockpiling medicine and food. Do you not think the British people deserve a second chance?
Well, I think they deserve a parliament and political parties and leaders who are prepared to be responsible rather than avoid their responsibility, which is what's going on at the moment, and by grandstanding in public for purposes of future political ambition. They're peeling away from the compromise, which will obviously involve some courage and sacrifice, which they ought to be making on behalf of the country. And that's what frightens me. And I think there's something about politics, and particularly the awful dialogue of the deaf politics we have now, where neither side listens to the other, where it seems perfectly possible to me that in pursuit of ambition and for laying down markers for the future, they will get us into that situation, yes.
Perfect. Peter Hitchens, Andrew Adonis, thank you very much for taking the time today. That's all we've got time for. Cheers.